Was there something hypocritical about the fact that the South existed and the North could point the finger? And then when the Civil Rights Acts were passed in the early 60s, you couldn't point the finger anymore?
Well, there was no doubt about the hypocrisy of large segments of the nation on the whole question of racial equality. I think the best example is that many of the senators from the North and the West, and congressmen generally, who voted for civil rights legislation in '64 and even '65 with the Voting Rights Bill, refused last year to vote for civil rights legislation because it dealt with an issue applicable to the North, the whole housing question. And this, it seems to me, was the greatest expression of the hypocrisy of many of our citizens and many of the senators and congressmen of the North.
But isn't that part of the dilemma now? That people knew that Negroes were being denied what was guaranteed to them by the Constitution, by the fact that they were citizens of this country. Then when they were given those rights, do you feel the white community said, well, we've given them all that we have, now it's up to them?
Well, I think the dilemma is much deeper, and I think one during this period of transition has to be very honest with America. And honesty impels me to admit that America has broad racist elements still alive. Racism is still existing in American society in many areas of the society, North and South. And the other thing is that there has never been a single, solid, determined commitment of large segments of white America on the whole question of racial equality. I think we have to see that vacillation has always existed, ambivalence has always existed, and this to me is the so-called white backlash. It's merely a new name for an old phenomenon. I see the white backlash as a continuation of the same ambivalence and vacillation of white America on the whole question of racial justice that has existed since the founding of our nation. I think the other thing that we must see at this time is that many of the people who supported us in Selma, in Birmingham, were really outraged about the extremist behavior toward Negroes. But they were not at that moment, and they are not now, committed to genuine equality for Negroes. It's much easier to integrate a lunch counter than it is to guarantee an annual income, for instance, to get rid of poverty for Negroes and all poor people. It's much easier to integrate a bus than it is to make genuine integration a reality and quality education a reality in our schools. It's much easier to integrate even a public park than it is to get rid of slums. And I think we are in a new era, a new phase of the struggle, where we have moved from a struggle for decency, which characterized our struggle for 10 or 12 years, to a struggle for genuine equality. And this is where we are getting the resistance, because there was never any intention to go this far. People were reacting to Bull Connor and to Jim Clark rather than acting in good faith for the realization of genuine equality.
Do you think white people in this country, and I'm talking about non-segregationists, people devoid or thinking they're devoid of racism, do you have any idea of what they want the Negro to be in America?
Well, it depends on the level that we are talking here, because I think you have to make a distinction between the people who are genuinely and absolutely committed in the white community on the question of racial equality. And I must confess that I think they're in a very small minority. I think the vast majority of white Americans will go but so far. It's a kind of installment plan for equality, and they are always looking for an excuse to go but so far.
Why are they looking for the excuse? What is it about the Negro? I mean, every other group that came as an immigrant somehow, not easily, but somehow got around it. Is it just the fact that Negroes are black?
That's a part of it, and growing that grows out of something else. You can't thingify anything without depersonalizing that something. If you use something as a means to an end, at that moment you make it a thing and you depersonalize it. The fact is that the Negro was a slave in this country for 244 years. That was a willful thing that was done. The Negro was brought here in chains, treated in very inhuman fashion, and this led to the thingification of the Negro. So he was not looked upon as a person. He was not looked upon as a human being with the same status and worth as other human beings. And the other thing is that human beings cannot continue to do wrong without eventually rationalizing that wrong. So slavery was justified morally, biologically, theoretically, scientifically, everything else. And it seems to me that white America must see that no other ethnic group has been a slave on American soil. That is one thing that other immigrant groups haven't had to face. The other thing is that the color became a stigma. American society made the Negro's color a stigma, and that can never be overlooked. So I think these things are absolutely necessary. The other thing is that America freed the slaves in 1863 through the Emancipation Proclamation of Abraham Lincoln, but gave the slaves no land or nothing in reality, and as a matter of fact, to get started on. At the same time, America was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that there was a willingness to give the white peasants from Europe an economic base. And yet it refused to give its black peasants from Africa, who came here involuntarily in chains and had worked free for 244 years, any kind of economic base. And so emancipation for the Negro was really freedom to hunger. It was freedom to the winds and rains of heaven. It was freedom without food to eat or land to cultivate, and therefore it was freedom and famine at the same time. And when white Americans tell the Negro to lift himself by his own bootstraps, they don't look over the legacy of slavery and segregation. I believe we ought to do all we can and seek to lift ourselves by our own bootstraps, but it's a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And many Negroes, by the thousands and millions, have been left bootless as a result of all of these years of oppression and as a result of a society that deliberately made his color a stigma and something worthless and degrading.
It isn't that they can't see the solution. It is that they can't see the problem. The Los Angeles, California riot had subdued, but the acrid smell of burnt wood and tar still hung heavy in the early morning air. A local television reporter scanned the crowd and spotted a familiar black community activist standing by a burnt-out grocery store. Sensing a good soundbite, the reporter asked for an interview. The bright lights came on, and the reporter began. 3 decades after the civil rights movement transformed the nation, why is the black community dissatisfied? Why have they rioted and destroyed their own neighborhood? What is the problem? The activist cocked his head and, in a voice mixed with anger and indignation, responded, "Surely, the gangs of the civil rights movement in the 60s were important, but they turned out to be superficial and largely symbolic. We can sit at a lunch counter and vote, but economically, the civil rights gangs took more from us than they gave. Some blacks got important big paying jobs in white businesses or government. Sure, we have our Colin Powells and Oprahs, but the black masses are left behind. So you see, integration came at the expense of the black community. Now things are worse than ever. We have more killings and crime, more school dropouts and drug users. Integration killed our communities. We have no black economic structure to solve the problems of our community. Our black churches and families are weak and struggling. We have yet to gain control of our communities and our destinies. The Vietnamese, Koreans, Indians, Iranians, and Mexicans are putting up profitable businesses in our neighborhoods. And we are still hopelessly vulnerable to every danger, from police brutality to violence and poverty. The next time we go to the Supreme Court, instead of integration, maybe we should seek separate but equal. The white newscaster forced a smile and said, but with all the rights, all the civil rights laws and blacks who have been elected to public office, surely things are better for black folks. What happened to the dream that Dr. King spoke of so eloquently more than 20 years ago? And that's why I added the Dr. King clip. Exasperated, the activist shook his head and walked away. At home, he waited for his interview to appear on the evening news. He had tried to explain the causes of black people's pains, confusion, and disappointment and anger. He cursed himself for not talking about black people's tiredness. He tried how tired they were of being the world's underdog. Even so, he hoped the world would be watching and listening. As the riot coverage aired on television, he saw close-up shots of the faces of distressed blacks. Looters scrambled in the background. He heard an elected official saying, now is the time for healing and the coming together among blacks and whites. He watched, but his interview never aired. The words of the reporter played again and again in his head. Surely things are better for blacks. As the black activist pushed the off button on his television set, a chipper weatherman concluded the news saying, sunny skies tomorrow. The newscaster's assumption is shared by millions of Americans. We ask each other what has gone wrong in the black community. What's wrong with blacks? Why can't they act like other ethnic racial groups in America? Talk shows seek the answers from leading black personalities who, when asked about the problem of black America, mouth well-worn platitudes. Perhaps they are fearful of raising the ire of mainstream America, or perhaps they are simply naive. Nevertheless, the solutions these blacks address only the symptoms affecting black America, not the causes. The root of the problem within black America is not teenage pregnancy, drugs, the decline of family values, anger, rap music, unemployment, or even the epidemic of violent crime. They are only symptoms of the deeper problem. The root problem in black communities across America is race and the unjust distribution of our nation's wealth, power, and resources. One race, the descendants of the white Europeans, seemingly has checkmated blacks' effort to improve themselves. Whites live in privileged conditions with nearly 100% ownership and control of the nation's wealth, power, and businesses at all levels of government support and resources, while society has a monopoly of ownership and control. White society has a monopoly of ownership and control. This monopoly of control resulted directly from centuries of abusive exploitation and expropriation of labor of darker races, black Americans of African descent. Though black Americans reside in the richest nation on earth, their standard of living is comparable to that of a third world nation. Blacks own and control less than 2% of the wealth, power, and resources of the nation, and they have little control over their lives and the conditions in which they are forced to live. Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back. Happy Monday, welcome back, and welcome back to On the Shoulders of Giants. I am Joseph Ward, and we are starting our reading of Claude Anderson's book, Black Labor, White Wealth. You guys, thank you for all the votes, for everybody who voted on the post and chose Black Labor, White Wealth, The Search for Power and Economic Justice by Dr. Claude Anderson. This is what we're reading now. We have completed The Destruction of Black Civilization. Great book, great book, great book. And we're moving on to another great book. And we're focusing more on issues in Black America. Black labor, white wealth. We were brought to be labor, as you can see, or as you heard from Dr. King. Now, I paired the Dr. King clip with our reading because he is hitting the nail on the head. And you know how white people like to use Dr. King to say that everything is better than equality and all this stuff here about America. But in his own words of telling you that if we don't have the economics, if we don't have the resources, if we don't have the land and the power, we have nothing. There's never been an equal redistribution of land, power, wealth, and resources anywhere in the world, especially not here in America. And because that has not happened, when you're fighting for civil rights, you're fighting for justice, equality, integration, amalgamation, as Chancellor Williams would say. But when you're fighting for gains within the white world with no power, you're only going to get the crumbs off the table, and you're only going to get what they choose to give you. You're never going to get what you actually want. You're never going to get what you're actually fighting for. You're only going to get what they choose to give you, because you have no power in making them give you anything. And they can throw you some crumbs to shut you up. And they can empower a handful of people from your race to make it seem like progress is truly made. But those are illusions of progress. That's illusion of wealth. That's illusion of Black people being better. I think now in 2025, and I could be incorrect. If I'm incorrect, just correct me in the comments. But if I believe now we only control like 4% of the nation's wealth, if that, no, I know it's no more than 4% of the nation's wealth. So we are still economically inadequate in 2025. We still don't have the resources. We still don't have the land. We're still begging white people to give us what we need for ourselves. Black labor, white wealth, and we still sign up to work for white people. We still sign up to empower and enrich everybody but ourselves. So this is the part of the programming where we look at the economics, going back and looking at the economics of it all and how we can change our economics. But we're going to start off learning how we were exploited for the gains of America, but never truly sought en masse to use our skills, our labor, and our work ethic to enrich and empower ourselves economically. So, chapter 1, the nature of the problem. I started off on page 8, and I'm picking back up on page 10, the paragraph, both the disparity between white and Black living conditions. All right. Both the disparity between Black and white living conditions and inadequate allocation of resources are centuries old problems. They are a major legacy of the peculiar institution called slavery. It was that social system that a white patriarchal society consigned Blacks to live in the most inhumane conditions, doing the harshest labor without just compensation. The dominant white society felt that stripping the Black slave of his humanity, all of his worldly possessions, his personal freedom, and keeping him hopeless, that Blacks would be forever non-competitive and powerless. Need to say, the dominant society's experiment on social engineering worked. The living conditions of a people enslaved or free tend to reflect their status and power within the larger society. Conditions in Black America are no more or less what was planned for them centuries ago. Solomon Northrop, a free Black who was kidnapped into slavery and later escaped, described the living standards of slaves in 1841 as befitting beasts of the fields. He wrote about extraordinary dehumanizing conditions that strip slaves of their individuality, their labor, and often their lives. Slaves lived in dilapidated, damp, dark chains, and their worldly possessions consisted of a few rags. A small board and a stick of wood served as their bed and pillows. There were no physical, financial, nor psychological comforts for them. And worst of all, slaves were intentionally kept without hope. A slave's life was committed to producing wealth and comfort for the white masters. The slaves suffered in silence, but routinely asked for their prayers and work songs. What? When will life get better for us, Lord? Their descendants collectively still await an answer. Legal and extra-legal measures were taken to keep both the free blacks and the slaves in a dependent state and excluded them from enjoying the fruits of a nation that their labor was building. Free blacks were forced to survive or perish off of marginal resources that extended into communities. One of the first lessons that free blacks learns was that without money and power, freedom for a black-skinned person was freedom in theory only. They were still bound by their conditions and non-white skin color. The largest society kept them bound by making black skin color a badge of inferiority and degradation. Blacks who escaped the plantations were not permitted to escape the boundaries of their own flesh. In reality, the socioeconomic conditions for blacks outside of slavery were only slightly better than those within the slavery system, right? And that's because, yes, they escaped and they had the physical freedom, but not the total freedom, not the economic freedom, not the political freedom, not the civil freedom. And was it truly freedom? It was freedom from bondage. It was freedom from labor. But was it actually true freedom? And are we really, truly free today? It's a good question, right? Being free for a black person meant being quasi-free. A black person was free as long as he could prove he was free, right? And even then, he had only a marginally greater chance concerning how he lived compared to his enslaved brethren. In 1841, while Solomon Northrop lamented the terrible conditions of more than 4 million black slaves, approximately 386,290 quasi-free blacks throughout the North were being subjected to Jim Crow practices, a multiplicity of local ordinances and social sanctions that prohibited them from sharing fully in an affluent American society. They were forced to survive in poverty and social decay. In the shadows of the American dream, blacks' freedom was little more than a cruel and sadistic joke, right? Local ordinances and social sanctions in the North and South restricted free blacks from earning competitive incomes. Their labor was sold for just barely above the cost of slave labor. Without sufficient income, few were able to secure decent food, health care, or housing. They remained legally free, but sought safe havens in large urban areas in the North, such as Philadelphia, Cincinnati, and Boston. The free black populations in and around these or any other large cities rarely exceeded 2% of the total population. These blacks lived off low quality food and had few worldly possessions. According to Leonard P. Curry, the author of Free Blacks in Urban America, 1800 to 1850, more than a third of the black population in cities like Boston lived in blind alley, cellars, and loft. They're poor and unsanitary. Their poor and unsanitary living conditions created rampant health problems and shortened their lifespans. Curry further stated that in 1855, Boston's city registrar, Dr. Josiah Curtis, found that the death rate among blacks was 99 times higher than whites. Today, 150 years later, the majority gap between the whites and blacks had narrowed only a little. The mortality, not the majority. The mortality gap between blacks and whites had only narrowed a little. Social pathology and inferior living conditions, not genetics, continue to control the life expectancy of blacks. Social pathology and inferior living conditions, not genetics, continue to control the life expectancy of blacks. We're not even in control of our own life expectancies at large. In the mid-1800s, the living conditions for free blacks were so desperate that nearly 50% had no choice but to seek some form of public welfare. In order to survive, large numbers of blacks publicly acknowledged that they were in a helpless state and were incapable of feeding, protecting, and sheltering and educating themselves and their children. Many black families became so desperate that they voluntarily re-entered slavery to survive. Others turned to public charity. But nearly every black who sought some form of public relief was refused. They were chastised for being uneducated and were called lazy and irresponsible for bearing children they could not support. Curry indicates that in Cincinnati, a typical northern urban area, Out of 3,296 cases in which the city granted relief to the needy, only 10 recipients were Black. And the assistance offered these fortunate Black recipients was only for their own burial expenses. Now, I want to highlight something. I want to say something. So I'm gonna stop it right here, but I'm gonna continue the reading. So, because they're talking about, that's one thing I learned working in HIV/AIDS prevention in the whole sexual health realm, right? So it's talking about Black people irresponsibly making children, and I'm not making an excuse for people making children that they can't afford, but sex is a coping mechanism to escape from the harsh realities that people live in. It's like a drug. And it's a drug of choice of some that they choose to escape the realities that they exist in. Now, an end result of sex is a child, especially unprotected sex, is a child. But Blacks were using sex as coping mechanisms. Blacks are still using sex as coping mechanisms to seek relief, to relieve the tension, to escape, to be free, to feel good in the midst of always feeling bad. Now, should sex be had as responsibly as possible? Yes. But we're also talking about desperate people on the edge, on the brink of going insane or giving up, who are seeking anything that can make them feel good. And for some, it's better than smoking crack. It's better than drinking. It's better than heroin. It's better than all these other drugs. But still, the end result of it is not necessarily the best overall for them economically, because it sets them back. So I just want to make that point. Public assistance tended to be distributed to whites only, including able-bodied male immigrants, while aid was denied to Black widows with small children. With the exception of a small number of abolitionists, the dominant society was indifferent to the living conditions of free Blacks. Rather than blaming white racism and slavery, white society blamed Blacks for their conditions, even though the conditions were not unique to Cincinnati or Boston. Similar horrendous conditions existed throughout the North and eventually gave rise to what became urban Black ghettos that symbolized the conditions of Blacks. The Emancipation Proclamation and subsequent constitutional amendments legally freed all Blacks and granted them citizenship without social and economic resources. The newly granted rights amounted to little more than paper rights. The government refused to compensate Blacks for their prolonged servitude by providing them with the necessary tools and resources to transition from a dependent labor class to an independent, competitive citizens. I'm gonna read that again. The government refused to compensate Blacks for their prolonged servitude by providing them with the necessary tools and resources to transition from a dependent labor class to independent, competitive citizens, right? The government does not want to do that and most likely will never do that. So we have to take that into account when we're planning. Instead of aiding Blacks, whites expected and urged the newly freed slaves to fend for themselves. They could work, seek public assistance, steal, or disappear. Some free Blacks could not work, were denied public assistance, and often could not leave the country. They had no choice but to accept what the dominant society offered them. Sharecropping, which was only but another form of servitude controlled by white plantation owners. So slavery by another name. That's sharecropping. That's slavery by another name. So you release the slaves with nothing, literally nothing, then expect them to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And then when they can't pull themselves up by their bootstraps, you offer them slavery again. But, you know, this is like slavery light. You know what I'm saying? That's how they often it. Like, it's not slavery. It's not slavery, but, you know, it's like slave-ish. It's more slave-ish than like slavery. So, you know, it's not like what your forefathers went through, but it's like, you know what I'm saying? You got a little more rights, but not all the rights. You're not a human. You're not a human. We ain't gonna treat you like no human. Say like I'm from Memphis. We ain't gonna treat you like you're not human. But you're not a slave. So 130 years after slavery, American society has become more pluralistic and competitive, but blacks' marginal conditions remain relatively unchanged. In some respects, they have worsened. The socioeconomic inequalities that existed between whites and blacks during and shortly after slavery are now structural. The socioeconomic inequalities that existed between whites and blacks during slavery and shortly after are now structural. For example, on the eve of the Civil War, records indicate that more than 50% of free blacks were paupers. All free blacks collectively held less than 0.5% of the nation's wealth, with wealth being defined as a great quantity of money or valuable goods or resources within both the private and public sectors. A century later, the 1960s, an era considered by many as great decade of progress for blacks, more than 55% of all blacks in America were still impoverished and below the poverty line. And blacks barely held 1% of the nation's wealth. According to the 1990 census, approximately 40% of all black families are receiving public assistance, and the number is increasing, with more than 56% of all black female-headed households beneath the poverty level. Black unemployment has not significantly improved. In comparative terms, over the last century, according to Curry and historian, black unemployment exceeded 40% in the 1850s. The National Urban Leagues, NUL, 1992 State of Black America report differed with the U.S. government figures, indicating that the hidden and true unemployment rate is approximately 28% for black adults and nearly 55% for black youth. The NUL's discomfort index further indicated that black employment worsened between 1960 and 1990. While economic conditions for white society improved, blacks' lack of progress was reflected in the fact that blacks earned 53% of what whites earned in 1948. In the 1990s, after nearly 50 years of civil rights activities and affirmative action programs, blacks earned 59 cents of what whites earned. And so that's only 9 cents more, right? Further, the 1990 census indicated that blacks per capita net worth is $9,359 versus $44,980 for whites. And remember, this book was published in, I believe, 2001. Let me make sure. Well, this book is copyrighted in 94. The copyright is 94. I thought it was published in 91, but the copyright of the book is 1994. So that's the time, just giving you a time frame of when the book was written. So time frame around 94. So we'll say that. So like their ancestors, blacks today have the same set of options, and they still lack employment opportunities and public jobs of black businesses because most white businesses are inaccessibly in the suburbs. They still are denied or expunged from public assistance roles, as they have yet to learn how to disappear. Many blacks have turned to crime. They are therefore criminalized in order to seek sustenance and wealth. And just as in the previous centuries, blacks continue to be disproportionately represented in the prison system. Curry indicated that in 1850, for example, blacks constituted 60% of all persons incarcerated in Maryland, and half of them were under 16 years of age, right? During the same period in the United States, in the states of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, blacks made up more than 50% of the prison populations. Today, prison rolls show similar percentages of blacks. Approximately 30% of all black males in America are either in prison, on parole, or probation. Still, they are luckier than many of their counterparts who annually fall victim to the homicide crisis, which each year claims more lives than the total number of American soldiers killed in either the Korean or the Vietnam War. So they're saying each year around this time, probably even today, I'm not sure, I got to look at the numbers, but the number of blacks being killed by blacks each year totals more than the Korean War and the Vietnam War combined. In the final analysis, Black America remains trapped in a dire dilemma. Some organizations have tried to call the nation's attention to the plight of blacks. In 1990, a 5-year report by the National Research Council, a Washington-based research organization, indicated that the social and economic gains that blacks made during the 1950s and the 60s largely ended in the 1970s. The Washington Post in June 1990 summarized the study, reporting, "There has been no significant black progress for the past 20 years, and a great socioeconomic gulf now separates the blacks from the Europeans and other ethnic groups in America." Unfortunately, the NRC study received little media attention or public response, even from black civil rights organizations, right? Most blacks are concerned about what is happening in their communities and not their race, even if the media and the power structure are not. They actively participate in the political process to complain to their elected representatives about the worsening conditions, but the political system seems unable to stimulate change. Harold Cruz, a black historian, believes that among those who do care about the black problem, nothing is being done because no one knows what to do about it. Considering the magnitude of Black America's impoverished and powerless state, Cruz is probably right. But why is it that society does not know what to do? Is it that the leaders of the society lack the knowledge or resources to solve the problems of Black America? Or is it that they lack the incentive and commitment to create valuable means for blacks to empower themselves as a group? Why should this nation's leaders do something to address the fundamental problems affecting blacks? The answer is simple. The United States' superiority among the industrial and agricultural world powers was achieved because the exploitation of blacks. The exploitation established and now maintains a privileged racial class whose wealth and power explains and legitimizes the system's inequalities. Wealthy conservative whites control public and private sector resources and tools that have kept blacks impoverished and powerless in a racially competitive society. You cannot compete with nothing. You cannot compete with nothing. You cannot compete with continuous setbacks. You cannot compete with continuous incarcerations, continuous homelessness, like nothing, like no resources, no wealth, no power, no land, continuous setbacks. That's a hell of a mountain to climb. Like, you're looking at that mountain like, how the hell are we ever going to get to the top of that mountain? Every time we make significant gains, there are setbacks. So how do we get to the top of the mountain? How do we do something nobody has done? And so now we get to the part of the book where he's talking about the conservatives versus the liberals and like the white abolitionists, right? The conservatives, well, it goes back to what me, PC, and Pat been telling people. Stop aligning yourself with political parties. Neither the conservatives nor the liberals have our back. Dr. King said there's a small percentage, a minority percentage of white people who actually care, who actually down for us. We already know that. There ain't a lot of John Browns out there, right? The conservatives will try to sway us to the right. The liberals will try to sway us to the left. The conservatives will say the liberals keep lying to you. The liberals are saying the conservatives are racist. Now, of course, we know Black America has sided more with the liberals because they've gotten more out of the liberals, even though that hasn't been much. But the conservatives are saying, hey, we're telling you the truth. So come rock with us, because look at what the liberals are doing now. Because the things that Dr. Anderson is explaining in this part of the chapter are the same things that are happening now. Nothing has changed. And that's the frustrating part. This book been around for a long time, giving us the plays, and we still falling for the okie doke. Black conservatism is not the way. Black liberalism is not the way. Black people have to side with Black people. We have to make either side compete for our votes. The liberals are going to lie to us. The conservatives are going to give us a big fuck you in the face, right? The liberals going to give us a fuck you behind the back. Neither party has our best interests. And so since neither party has our best interests, what do we do? Where do we go from there? Like, what is the best course of action for Black people? I'm just saying. Then he goes into talking about the alliance between the Blacks and the Jews, and how, like whites, a few individuals have sided with the Blacks. Individuals have sided with the Blacks, but not the white race as a whole and not the Jews as a whole. Individuals. Blacks have benefited both the Jews and the whites and the Jews. Individuals have had some benefits for the Blacks. But there has been no true alliance of any group of people with Black people. This is what Dr. Claude Anderson is getting at. This is what Dr. John Henry Clark has told us. Our historians keep telling us that no group of people en masse, including the Hispanics, so this Black and brown alliance is not real. Just because individuals who are brown are down with Blacks doesn't mean that there's a true Black and brown alliance. If so, where is it? Where have the brown people en masse been? We cannot find mass movements of any group of people aligning with and aiding with Blacks. So let's just make sure that's understood. There's never been a mass movement of any group of people who have aligned themselves with Black people for the betterment and the upliftment of Black people. Individuals, but not masses. But Black people show up in masses for others. So Anti-black conservatism from 1980 to 1992 served as severed the fragile relationship that was beginning to build between blacks and the government. Government established new priorities that reversed most of the progress made by blacks during the 1960s. It withdrew its marginal support of blacks for political and racial reasons, just as it did during the Reconstruction period following the Civil War. President Lyndon Johnson acknowledged the social and economic inequalities of black life. Through his Great Society programs, he sought to do what government had failed to do during Reconstruction, to relieve the depressed conditions of Black America by redistributing opportunities and self-development tools. But again, the largest society would not tolerate it. Emphasis on the largest society, right? There was a backlash against all programs and policies that suggested wealth and power redistribution between blacks and whites. Conservative whites opposed public policies that mandated busing, affirmative action, quotas, equal housing opportunities, set-asides, and racial preferences. Conservatives insisted on their actions were not racist and that they were committed to equal opportunities for blacks. The hypocritical difference between their rhetoric and actions was similar to the old times that everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. They proclaimed a belief in equality and parity for blacks, but they would not accept the measures that were needed to bring about that equality and parity. Oh man, all that talking. But remember, these are not just conservatives, these are also liberals. Richard Nixon, the presidential successor to Lyndon Johnson, rode into the highest public office in this nation on the conservative white backlash to Black Power protests in the late 1960s. Sound familiar? That's how people view Trump. Shortly after this 1968 election, his domestic advisor, Daniel Moynihan, sent out the first signal that the federal government was ready to use its power to put blacks back in their place by blaming them, not racism, for the breakdown of the black family and community, as well as the widespread poverty and powerlessness that affected the black community. The conservatives' national goal was to abandon the civil rights agenda and move towards a colorblind society. That sounds like the liberals these days, don't it? In 1970, Moynihan issued his infamous benign neglect memorandum that announced a new public policy on blacks. The policy behind the memorandum moved attention away from blacks, saying the time may have come when the issue of race could benefit from a period of benign neglect. We may need a period in which Negro progress continues and racial rhetoric fades. Moynihan's memorandum signaled that the old governmental policies of using blacks as cheap labor was ending, and the new policy would declare blacks obsolete. Dr. Claude Anderson has been warning us that for a while. We will be rendered obsolete very soon, and we are creeping up on that, and we are helping to accelerate that process. Alfonso Pickney, in his book, The Myth of Black Progress, indicated that Moynihan's memorandum encouraged the supplanting of blacks with other ethnic groups. Moynihan wrote that greater attention to Indians, Mexican Americans, and Puerto Ricans would be useful. The government justified supplanting blacks by promoting the myth that Black Americans were making extraordinary progress. The nation swallowed the myth of Black progress. Meanwhile, real change in Black America's conditions never got off the ground. Does that sound familiar? So they're telling us that we're progressing, but when we look at the real numbers, we're not. We are regressing, but they're still telling us that we're doing better than ever. Still telling us that we're great, but the numbers, the real numbers are showing us that we are regressing, while the attention is being on the illegal immigrants. Most Black Americans did not agree with Moynihan's assessment that blacks had created their social ills through self-infected pathologies, and blacks didn't accept the government's claim that they were making extraordinary social and economic progress. Making progress compared to what and whom, they asked, right? History has taught blacks that they, not the powerful, the powerful social and economic system are always blamed for their deplorable living conditions. Dominant societies believe that the negative conditions of Black America are self-inflicted is based upon the fact that the conditions that based on the conditions that Blacks endure are almost peculiar to what? What? All right, let me read that again. Hold on. That don't make sense. So history has taught Blacks that they, not the powerful social and economic system, are always blamed for their deplorable living conditions. Dominant societies believe that the negative conditions of Black America are self-inflicted is based upon the fact that the conditions that Blacks endure are almost peculiar to Blacks alone. Okay, that ain't make sense the first time. All right. White society has never been enthusiastic about helping Blacks, nor has it permitted them to acquire the tools to help themselves. Blaming Blacks for their underclass status keeps the larger society free from recriminalizations or obligations for Blacks. Ironically, if the deplorable conditions of Black America were experienced by white America for even a shorter period of time, the government would not hesitate to declare a national disaster and activate emergency assistance measures. But since the oppressive socioeconomic conditions have been peculiar to Black America for centuries, no such governmental intervention has been expected. Basically saying, the government is saying, well, Black people are used to being slaves. They're used to being on bottom. They used to living in squalors. They used to living in tenements. They used to sleeping on the ground. They used to living like animals. Hey, we see them as animals. So why should we help them? Animals don't need help. Animals just need room to roam free. Like Dr. King said, when you have been seen as a tool, you would not be viewed as a human. When you are seen and used, not just seen, when you are even used as a tool, you are no longer human. You're a thing, not a human. The Negro is a thing, not a human. The death of the Black Civil Rights Movement. For everyone but the caretakers of the old Black civil rights organizations, the civil rights movement for Blacks is dead. Civil rightism for Blacks had a brief life for the second time within a 100-year period, reached a point of diminishing returns, then died a premature death during the late 1960s. All of the rights gained by the civil rights movement have been bequeathed to groups that are more acceptable to the large society. Women's, gays, Hispanics, Asians, handicaps, and poor whites. Black Lives Matter. They're talking about you, Black Lives Matter. But not just Black Lives Matter, but the NAACP, Urban League, and all these other groups that are supposed to be for Blacks that are helping everybody but Blacks, right? The first Black civil rights efforts formally started shortly after the Civil War, where slaves realized that they had received proper paper freedom and unexercisable rights. For nearly a century, they pursued their phantom freedom and rights nationally by way of public forums, courtrooms, schoolhouses, union halls, and journalism. In the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education desegregation decision, Blacks won the battle, but the decision had incalculable destructive efforts on the Black community. During the subsequent civil rights protest period, Blacks stimulated a rush of new social movements by a mileage of social groups which piggybacked on Black causes in their own quest for rights and freedoms. Just like now, everybody jumps on the Black movement, hijacks it, and the movement never satisfies Blacks, right? This offered the larger society in general and gave conservatives grounds to orchestrate a backlash. Since Blacks were the largest, most visible, and least acceptable group, they became the primary target of conservatives' anger. The movement was drowned out by the new groups and outflanked by the conservatives. In the heat of various civil rights battles for control over jobs, schools, housing, community services, businesses, and tax dollars, Black leadership ran out of insight, social tools, and strategies for effectively dealing with the more subtle and less direct forms of racism. As the other groups began to take away from blacks control of the civil rights agenda, conservative political forces started using their government and media power to diminish the black component of the civil rights movement. They successfully destroyed the legitimate base of the black movement by diluting the movement beyond recognition. They identified every group that could possibly perceive itself as aggrieved and made it equal to blacks. Thus, the public perception of blacks was severely damaged and distorted. The unique problems that they faced were made to appear no more important than the problems faced by other so-called victims of discrimination. Like we see today, right? The LGBTQ movement is compared to the civil rights movement often. The black civil rights movement, though spectacularly successful in many aspects, had at least 4 major flaws that diminished the accomplishments of the movement and left critical imperatives for Black America. Number 1, the movement's Black leadership focused its entire weight of resources on achieving integration. They believed, perhaps naively, that by removing all symbols of Jim Crowism and acquiring access to various segments of white society, Black people would gain equality. Nope. 2, Black leaders failed to focus on neutralizing the forces behind Jim Crowism or developing effective strategies for Black America to use in dealing with problems that spring forth from the maldistribution of racist control of wealth, power, and resources in America. 3, they failed to develop a long-term national plan with goals and strategies spelling out where Blacks ought to be going and how best to get there. And the last one, number 4, in addition to Black leaders failed to construct a national network of institutions to train new generations of Blacks who could successfully assume leadership positions and implement a national plan of empowerment. The combined effect of these 4 major flaws left the Black civil rights movement with no place to go, nowhere to get there, and no leadership to take them. And few visible Black organizations managed to survive by becoming politically correct and expanding their focus to include so-called minorities, poor people, gays, women, and abused children. They could not survive in the powerful conservative climate by continuing to target the problems of Blacks alone. Although Black conditions continue to need attention, most Black organizations could not raise enough money to survive by focusing solely on their own people. The surviving Black organizations remain visible by continuing to pursue integration. It would not have been necessary for Black organizations to abandon their own community if the civil rights movement had established a sense of community cohesiveness founded on group economics and group politics, and I'm going to add in a code of conduct. The National Urban League and the NAACP are still active, but they have lost much of their influence and membership. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Council, or SNCC, and the Black Panther Party are defunct. The Congress of Racial Equality joined the conservative ranks of a national political party, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference barely survives. The nation's political apparatus disabled many of the civil rights groups by destroying or neutralizing Black leadership. Adam Clayton Powell and Stokely Carmichael were discredited. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Medgar Evers were assassinated. Rap Brown, Eldridge Cleaver, Angela Davis, and prominent members of the Black Panthers were criminalized. Many of the others were enticed into mainstream society. Consequently, the large block of Black leadership was eradicated, changed, or disappeared after just one generation following the Great Movement. Having failed to address the structural conditions of Black America, the 1960s left little structure upon which Blacks could build. Instead, that colorful era only left faded memories and soul-stirring songs. The void created by the death of Black civil rights presented the opportunity for a cadre of Black non-conservatives to join the popular white conservative movement and proclaim themselves and their new organizations the new Black leadership. They were publicly blessed by the highest levels of government in corporate America, and they offered Black America political and economic ideologies that were taken right from the conservative right-wing political Bible. Their politically correct ideologies advocated less government and taxes, free market economies, privatization of government services, and race-neutral government policies. Black traditional leadership, like the black masses, was ignored by government and the masses, and the media, except during the times of racial disturbances and anniversaries of the movement. He concludes this chapter by saying, the problem of race and resources has been festering for hundreds of years, but has yet to arise as the core public issue in America. Whites have inherited the power and wealth of their ancestors through a social and economic structure designed and weighed to the advantage of non-blacks. Blacks have inherited a legacy of permanent poverty and powerlessness. Black labor made the nation a strong, wealthy, international world power, but nothing has been proposed to seriously bring about remuneration, parity, and fairness to Black people. It is clear that Blacks must both solve their own problems and structure a national plan of action that puts their priorities first and foremost. Self-empowerment is the only road to economic justice, but it requires the support of a national policy and plan of action with a code of conduct and Black people who give a damn and are willing to work to create something for ourselves. So we laying the foundation for Black labor, white wealth, right? So this first chapter is chapter 1, the nature of the problem, from page 8 to page 27. From page 8 to page 27 is chapter 1, the nature of the problem. So that's this week's video. Next week's video will be chapter 2, power and Black progress, from page 28 to 28 to 44, power and Black progress. And he gonna go into what is power. But, you know, we laying the foundation of what happened to Black people. Why don't we have any economic power? Why are we left out in the cold? Why is there a wealth gap? Why haven't we built anything? What is the nature of the problem? What's the root of the problem? White people say we are the problem. They say our behavior, the way we treat ourselves, the way we treat others, our laziness, our shiftlessness, it's in our nature to be inadequate. It's in our nature to be on bottom. We are inferior by nature. That's what they tell us. That's what they teach us. Now, Dr. Anderson was focusing, he had a rightful focus on the conservatives. But here in 2025, we need to side out both the conservatives and the liberals. Neither have our side, neither have our back. No group, no other group in abundance is aligned with Black people. Remember that. No other group in abundance. There may be individuals, but not groups in abundance. Shout out to the individuals, but no groups in abundance are our true allies. So we have to do this ourselves, but we have to know how to do it, because we're attempting to do something nobody has ever done. So let's not act like we have the answer, because we don't, because it's never been done. But what we can do is put the pieces of the puzzle together, see what map we get. And hopefully this map can lead us somewhere. But we got to do something more than just trying to find a comfortable place within white society, because that comfortable place will lead us obsolete. And once we become obsolete, there are no more resources for us. Make sure you like this video, comment, subscribe, and share. Thank you to everybody who watching this video. Thank you to everybody who's supporting On the Shoulders of Giants. If you want to support me, want to support PC or Pat, those links are in the description. Thank you to everybody who have been supporting us. Thank you to me, Kim. I greatly appreciate you. Thank you, thank you, thank you for your continued support. And everybody who continues to support me, my family in Paris, I appreciate you. And let's continue learning and applying. Black Labor, White Wealth, Chapter 1. Here it is. See y'all later.